Hello friends, my name is Eric Cloward and welcome to the Stoic Coffee Break. The Stoic Coffee Break is a weekly podcast where I take an aspect of Stoicism and do my best to break it down to its most important points. Sometimes that's me interviewing somebody, sometimes that's me just talking about what's on my mind for that week. I share my successes and my failures and hope you can learn something from my experience. Today's episode is called Anxious Future. Do you feel like the world is in chaos right now? I know that there are plenty of us that feel that way. If you spend a day on social media, you'll find all kinds of things wrong with the world. Is the world truly more chaotic? Are things really falling apart more so than in the past? Today I want to talk about some of the reasons why many of us feel like the world is kind of a mess right now. The mind that is anxious about future events is miserable. Seneca. So it's really easy in our era to feel anxious. I mean, there's always something that we can worry about. But where does this anxiety come from? At a base level, anxiety and worry come from worrying about the future. We worry about personal issues such as our relationships, finances, and work. We worry about global issues such as the cost of food, price of energy, climate change, political upheaval, and the list just goes on. And these are all things that can cause us a lot of stress and worry, mostly because there is very little that we can actually do about it. And I think that the world, the universe, is doing what it always has done, and we just have a hard time because we expect things to be otherwise. The Twitter user, the Stoic Emperor, had a great quote. He said, "The news allows you to dedicate massive amounts of energy and attention to things you probably cannot impact, while the things that you can impact go unaddressed." And this, for me, kind of points out one of the most important things that causes a lot of anxiety in our lives, and that is that we simply are exposed to much more of the world than we used to be. Because of the massive increases in the amount of news available to us, we don't just hear about the bad news in our local area or even just our country. We find out about bad news all over the world in ways that weren't even possible 20, 30, or 40 years ago. Now, this isn't to say that we don't have real problems happening in the world. While there has always been war and famine and natural disasters, we now face a lot of issues with climate change and dwindling resources. It can oftentimes feel hopeless because there is so little that we can impact. And this is also not to say that we shouldn't look to and prepare for the future, because putting our heads in the sand and ignoring the perils of the world isn't a prudent or wise idea. But I think that this hopelessness that people feel, well, it's easy to fall into a lot of outrage and self-righteousness when we watch or listen to the news. There's so much wrong in the world, and the moral superiority we feel by being on the right side of something feels really good. But when we stop and think about it, what does our moral outrage do? Does it prompt us to make any changes? Do we take up a cause and do something about it? In most cases, we don't. We feel good because we're on the right side of an issue and forget about it as we move on to the next outrage or the next distraction on Twitter. Now, it's important that we recognize that much of the news is simply there to manipulate our emotions and to be sensational or shocking or salacious. And why is that? Why do you think that people would want to get other people so stirred up like this? I think mostly it just comes down to money and power. Anger and outrage are easy to sell. People who are angry are far easier to manipulate than people who are calm, thoughtful, and relaxed. When we understand this, we can be more aware of our reactions to the news and choose to spend our emotional energy more effectively. What really frightens and dismays us is not external events themselves, but the way in which we think about them. It is not the things that disturb us, but our interpretation of their significance. Epictetus. So, what things make you anxious about the future? And what can we do to lessen our distress and anxiety? How do we manage our minds so as not to get bogged down and feel so overwhelmed all the time? I find for me that mostly ignoring the news is kind of helpful. And it's not that I don't want to be informed. It's just that there is so much clamor and sensationalist garbage that absolutely has no impact on my life. And I also do my best to find news sources that try to be unbiased and bring factual reporting to the front with an open-mindedness and also supporting of the latest scientific facts. Basically, I'm trying to find the signal of truth amongst the noise. Now, I'm not saying that watching the news is bad per se, because it's good to know what's happening in the world. But keeping a perspective on what is actually happening, that the world is always changing, and not fearing it, because most of the horrible tragedies and everything that we see out there are really outside of our control. And when we remember this allows us to be a lot more accepting of what happens. But just because we accept what is happening doesn't mean that we should resign ourselves to passivity. It just means that we should be cognizant of what we can have an effect on and do our best to make a positive impact on the world in any way that we can. We can also practice to do our best to prepare for whatever we can by paying attention to events and imagining the worst that can happen. And that's not as an exercise to stress ourselves out, but so that we're not surprised if these things happen. And I've used this myself to relieve anxiety, because once you've already experienced the worst case in your mind, in a sense, you've already been through it. And if the worst case does happen, you are prepared for it. But I find that usually the worst case doesn't happen. And in those cases, you're happily surprised with a much better outcome than you expected. Another thing we can do is to look around and see where we can actually have an impact on the world. Are there things you can do locally for your community? Can you find ways to volunteer? What action can you take to help make the world a little bit better rather than just flaming your opponents on social media? When we take the time to focus on what we can control and focus on being in the moment, we can loosen the grip of those anxieties about the future. Keeping ourselves in the present helps us to stop worrying about the uncertainty of the future and focus on the things that we can control, which are the things in the present. And that's the end of this week's Stoic Coffee Break. Be good to yourself, be good to others, and thanks for listening.